Hello boys and girls, guys and dolls, friends from near and far. Welcome back to the channel. Today we have something pretty cool on the bench. We have a 1959 Breitling Navitimer with a Venus 178 inside. As you can see, it has a all black dial, which was common in the first few years until they went to a sort of panda style. We also see it has this lovely beaded bezel, those tiny beads around the bezel there. And we also see that it has the AOPA dial with that winged open book logo. And we also see that it doesn't have the original crown and the pushers are pretty damaged. The case is overall in very nice condition, but the case back has a couple of scratches. But overall, a very nice Navitimer. Let's put it on a time grapher and see how it runs. And it runs fairly well, but obviously in need of a service. So let's get going. It's important with this model to take the bezel off first, because inside the bezel you have one part of the slide rule that Navitimer is famous for. And a slide rule is actually specifically developed for pilots, which of course also featured heavily in their marketing. This ad here even shows the price, very expensive back in the mid-60s. At least to me, Navitimer is the most famous model from Breitling. Of course, they have a lot of models that are quite famous, like the Chronomat is famous, Uptime. But the Navitimer always had a bit of a special position, I feel. Originally introduced back in the early 50s, 1952, I think it was. But really gaining traction in this partnership with the AOPA. That's the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association in the US. So when you see Navitimers from this period, especially the ones with the full black dials and this AOPA logo, they are quite sought after. The other models you'll find from this time is the Twin Planes model, where instead of the AOPA logo, you have this double-looking airplane, twin airplanes, which is a little bit less sought after, but still a beautiful watch, obviously. I mentioned that inside the watch we have the Venus 178. The 178 is basically the 175 with an added hour counter function. We also do have a video on Venus 175. So if you haven't seen that, that's also an interesting video. So we're working on taking apart the hour counter function now. And you see a couple of these bridges that we've taken off are really there to support the dial. It's a relatively chunky movement, but gotta love those old movements. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about the movement when we assemble it again. But just for now, note that I'm putting the screws back into place. That is a pretty good thing to do when you're working on a movement with a lot of screws, like this one. So we're over on the train side. And there's a lot of parts, obviously, in this, but the good thing with mechanical watches is that everything is logical. Everything has a good purpose. So it's actually not that difficult to understand, but as noted before, the first thing you should do if you work on the movement is to make sure you understand how it works, what the different parts actually do. So while we are rather unceremoniously disassembling this movement, maybe talk a little bit about Breitling. And by the way, I have my sexy voice on today. Seem to sort of get this colds every now and then. I moved into a new house here in Switzerland just a few months back. And now winter is sort of knocking on the door. And I noticed there was no heating. The house was so cold. It's like probably 14, 15 degrees in the house. So yesterday this guy came by for the heating and turned out the water pipes were closed. So the hot water from this big boiler we have in the basement didn't actually go to the radiators. So yeah, that explains my sexy voice. Let the music play. Oh, baby, blah, blah, blah. All right, thanks, Barry. And we were going to talk about Breitling. So there's, for some odd reason, a sort of common misconception that Breitling is a German brand. It's not. It's Swiss. It's named after the founder, Leon Breitling. And it's actually pretty old, from the 1880s. They always had a focus on chronographs, and they have really set their marks in chronograph history. They were the ones introduced the first two-pusher chronograph, for instance. Introduced the first automatic chronograph in a partnership with a lot of other companies, but still. And all the way back in the early 1900s, Leon Breitling himself patented this tachymeter scale that is very common in chronographs. And a tachymeter scale is, of course, to measure speed. So one of the early adopters of this was the Swiss police, who then started issuing speeding tickets. So thanks a lot, Leon. But despite being so vital in the whole chronograph development, they actually never had their own movements. They always used movements from other manufacturers, like Venus, of course, like Valjoux. First Navitimers even had a Valjoux 72 movement. But in 2010, they came with their first in-house movement, Caliber 01, which is a fantastic name for first movement, seriously. Instead of calling it, I don't know, a 3B0251, they just call it 01. No bullshit. That movement has been developed further. The first generation had quite a few issues, actually, but that seems to all have been worked out now. At the same time, Breitling has always been a higher-end brand, and that sort of begs the question, where does the added value then come from? Because their movements aren't that fantastically decorated or anything. Neither is the dial, nor the case. So they must be doing something right. Anyway, these fingers we see on screen have been using multiple screwdrivers and what have you to basically disassemble the whole watch. Just gonna get the mainspring out of the barrel. Now we see the mainspring seems to have a lot of spring left in it. So we can reuse it, just need to clean it. So let's stuff those baskets. Hey, I think we're gonna need more baskets. So while our lovely Elma machine does some work for us, let's have a look at the bezel and the crystal. This bezel shouldn't be very stuck. And when we take it out, we see there's a nice little dirt imprint on the mat. Actually, the crystal is also pretty badly scratched, both on the inside and the outside. I think this crystal has been with the watch for a really long time. First thing we always do is to get the mainspring back in the barrel. This is a manual wind watch, of course, so we're not gonna grease the sides of the barrel, but we'll put some grease at the bottom. And use our little winder. And there we go. The shock settings on this watch are not very common. I believe they're the Unishock kind, but they work pretty much like KIF or others, except that the spring and the capsule is in one piece. I talked a little bit about it already, but we see that the movement is not particularly decorated. It's a good looking movement, sure, but it's basically just a perlage under the balance wheel. That's something a bit more special. Otherwise interesting is this really big opening for the barrel. Put a little bit D5 there. That's to be able to run the hour counter on the other side. Also the fourth wheel. It's a little bit tricky to get in and out. You have to make sure that that little lip in the main plate is in between two of the spokes on the wheel. Otherwise you might damage the pivots. Before we put this 3/4 plate on, we noticed there was a little bit too much end shake in the third wheel. So we're gonna adjust that just a little bit. Itsy bitsy tiny little bit. And then we can put the plate back. Now, given that there's a lot of parts going on and off on this movement, I chose not to show the epilam of the escape wheel and the pallet fork this time. But you can, for instance, watch the Omega 712 service to see that in more detail. So we're getting the base movement back together. We want to make sure the train runs freely. And then we can put on the crown wheel and the ratchet wheel and do the keyless works. There are a few different ways, of course, to skin a cat. Man, shouldn't say that. I actually have a cat now. So, there are many ways to cheat the tax collector. Maybe that's a better one, actually. So there are a lot of ways to cheat the tax collector. You can, for instance, stash away money in Swiss banks. or the Cayman Islands, or in your mattress. Let's interrupt that for a second with putting on a new crown, an actual Breitling crown. Gonna look a little bit better with the watch. But more importantly, ways to cheat on taxes. Of course, a crowd favorite is to report a little bit too much on travel costs, for instance. Another is to have bank accounts in those services that are not regulated or reported to the government, like Revolut. Another is, of course, to have a company that you can put all kinds of expenses on, even your wife's manicure, at least the ones you don't perform for free, just with a lot of emotional suffering. Of course, if you do have your own company, then accepting cash payments will help a lot. Okay, okay, and let's not give away all the secrets now. Let's get back to this watch, actually. Well, actually, let's get back to the previous watch we serviced on the channel, the Longines Admiral. I thought it would be fun in that video to pretend that I fixed the winding pinion with super glue. That is not possible. So my apologies if anyone now put a lot of super glues in their old movements. It is not a way to repair anything, and super glue has no place in watch movement. I just thought it would be fun to sort of make a gag around that, but I did get a replacement part. So it was in fact a new old stock winding pinion that I got hold of and then put into the watch. So just to reiterate that, do not use super glue. Duct tape, okay. Super glue, no. And speaking of super glue, here we are greasing or oiling the pallet stones, or rather the pallet stone, the exit pallet stone. And whenever we do put some lubrication in the watch, it's of course to reduce friction, because those teeth on the escape wheel actually scrape along the rubies there. But with a little bit of lubrication, that scraping is more of a sliding movement. All right, we got the watch ticking. Let's have a look at the time grapher. After oiling, of course. On one note here, we in general do not oil the pallet fork pivots. Actually, Psycho often advises that you should, but pretty much everyone else says do not oil the pallet fork pivots. But I did that in one of the videos, so just wanted to let you know. Again, I'm not going to show the whole adjustment thing here. I think if you want to see a video on how to adjust the watch, I could suggest the Zenith Surf video. For watches that do not have a mobile stud carrier, you could look at the AOPA video. Now, as mentioned, there's a lot of ways to cheat on the taxes. But let's not get into that. I wanted to say that because there's a lot of ways to assemble a chronograph also. Some people prefer to put the entire chronograph train together before they put in the pallet fork and the balance. That way you can see if the entire chronograph train runs freely and nicely. So that's a different way to do it. Personally, I prefer to see that the base movement runs nicely first. As mentioned during the disassembly, I basically put all the screws back into the screw holes. That is quite convenient when you have a lot of screws that are easy to mix up. So I'm not going to show that I'm taking all the screws out and putting them back. Well, I'm going to show that I put them back, but not that I'm unscrewing them. And when we're building the chronograph itself, there are also different ways of doing that, obviously. One important thing is that the chronograph driving wheel that sits on top of the extended pivot on the fourth wheel is at the same level as the clutch wheel. That is very important. So if it is not, then we need to adjust it. Otherwise, the train wheel side of the chronograph is perhaps not straightforward, but very classic. Logical layout, column wheel chronograph, very smooth to operate, and beautiful. Just gorgeous to look at. So once you understand the logic, then where the parts fit is quite easy to figure out. But obviously having a video to look at from the disassembly or having a manual is even better. Technical communication. Not that easy to find always for these 70-year-old movements, but anyway. One word on the lubrication. We're using a lot of D5 or HP 1300 in a chronograph like this. Basically all the different posts, all the different friction spots, like where the spring, for instance, holds back the hammer. We put D5 or HP 1300, put a little bit on the column wheel, on the ratchets under the column wheel, and so on. And we keep incessantly testing everything, of course. Every part we put on, we check that it works as it should. If it's rotating, let's check that it does so. OCD is not a bad thing for a watchmaker. Actually, it's not a bad thing for a lot of things. And after oiling the column wheel, we're gonna press the lever a few times so that we get the oil spread out. And then we also oil the heart-shaped cams on the chronograph wheel and the minute counter. Now, pretty much the last thing we're gonna assemble is the jumper for the minute counter. It's actually not a good idea at all to take that whole carriage or assembly off, because then you have to adjust it afterwards. It's better to just take the jumper itself off. And we can then turn to the dial side. This is the wheel that meshes with the barrel and then directly drives the hour counter. And as mentioned, the 178 is the 175 with an hour counter. And this part we're putting on here is connected to the other side of the main plate and is then operated by the levers. So this way we can engage the hour counter and disengage it or pause it and reset it and have it synchronized between the train side and the dial side. One tricky thing here, this little spring basically presses down on that wheel on top of the barrel, and it needs to be in such a place that the hammer can operate underneath it. So that's something that can be tricky sometimes. If you notice that our counter hammer doesn't go all the way in, then that is probably the issue. All right, almost there. This crescent looking bridge, as mentioned, it's really to hold the dial in place. So you build up support underneath the dial. And this construction, of course, makes the movement somewhat chunky, but it's also a big movement, so it doesn't feel chunky, at least not very chunky. Same thing with our wheel. Also has to build up under the dial, so it's got 2 steps on it. And with that, we can put the dial on and then have a little look at the case. For the case, it looks like it's never been touched. Well, obviously it's been touched, but not polished. So we're going to leave it unpolished. We're just going to clean it and shine it a little bit. But of course, we also take out the pushers and clean them, and we're also actually going to replace those old pushers because they were worn pretty badly. So together with a new crown, that's going to look much nicer. So everything does seem to work, so we can put the hands back on. Let's just clean them a little bit first, because they were quite dirty. We want to be careful with old hands like this. It's quite easy to scrape the gold plating off, so we don't want to do that, obviously. Sorry, it's a little bit out of focus here. Do not adjust your TV set. And there are a lot of ways to cheat on your taxes. And there's also a lot of ways to put the hands on a chronograph. You might have seen before I put the hour counter and the minute counter hands first. But I think it's actually better to put the seconds hand on first. So the chronograph seconds hand. Especially for these small hands, we need to be really careful. So I'm using a carbon tipped tweezer for that. And with all the hands on, we're pretty much ready for the crystal. The crystal isn't ready for us though. So we're going to need to put quite a lot of effort into this crystal actually. Because both the inside and the outside of the crystal are quite worn, a lot of deep scratches. So before we put this watch up for sale, we are going to put in a new crystal. But for now, let's use the existing one. It is in good enough condition after all that polishing. We're also gently going to put this part of the slide rule into the bezel. And with that, we're getting quite close actually to finishing this watch. Off camera, I also did polish the bezel and the case ever so slightly with some silver polish to get off some oxidation, make it shiny. And there we go. Gorgeous watch on the wrist with those new pushers and the original crown. Breitling Navitimer, AOPA version. Hope you liked this video. If you did, clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. We'll be back shortly. Until then, ta-ta.